Hello, everyone. Today is our first lesson on the module Strategic Financial Management. I am Sabran Sir, and I will be your tutor for the module. And I'm hoping to take you guys through the module content during the 10 tutoring sessions. Now, moving forward with today's lesson, as you can see, the module that I'm covering is Strategic Financial Management. So before talking about the learning outcome, I would want to just explain to you what strategic financial management is. So what is strategic financial management? So this is all about creating profit for the business and ensuring an acceptable return on investment. So financial management is accomplished through business financial plans, setting up financial controls, and financial decision making. So moving on with our, Okay, so moving on with the module content. So in this module, we will be focusing on 6 themes that are demonstrated in this slide. So as you can see, there are 6 themes. And let me just explain to you what we will learn under each theme. So under the organizational resources, we will talk about the different types of resources that are used by the company and how this can be allocated effectively and efficiently. And moreover, we will be covering the budget under controlling the budget and strategic planning in order to reduce the identified resource gap. So now under the introduction to financial management, what we will be covering would be areas such as the role and importance of financial environment and financial management, the financial market, and the identification of different types of risks and evaluating the investment decisions. Now, the third section would be business processes. So what is included under business processes? So we will be considering areas such as, let's say, different business processes, such as the ratio analysis, benchmarking, and as well as strategic audit. So the fourth theme that we will be talking about would be activity-based costing. So what are we going to learn under activity-based costing? So in this section, we will generally talk about activity-based costing, not just the costing. We will also be talking about the activity-based management and the cost management, and also a little bit of budgeting, where we talk about traditional budgets and then the beyond budgeting. So thereafter, as the 5th section, we will be talking about identification of risk. So under this theme, what would happen is we will be talking about the risk associated with the internal operations, management, and evaluation risk will all be considered under these lessons. And lastly, the theme that we will be focusing on would be communication. So different types of communication, such as internal communication and external communication, will be discussed here. And as it is very important that the different method that is identified to be effectively and efficiently managed the resources, communication will be one of the most important sections, because without communicating it to the stakeholders or the relevant stakeholders, all these plans will not come to effect properly. So here we will also talk about communication strategies. Moving on. Moving on, now I'm going to talk to you about the lesson specification. So under this lesson, As you can see below, below are the topics that will be covered under this lesson. So we will not be able to cover all these topics. However, I'm hoping to cover as much as possible, as this module contains many areas to be covered. So here, so this section will generally identify the importance of effective allocation of resources and efficient control of financial resources at the end of the lesson. And at the end of the lesson, you will be able to get good knowledge on the resource gaps, such as human resources, finances, as well as facilities. So also we will be talking about effective efficiency allocation, and also talk about the control of the financial resources. Under controls of financial resources, we will be talking about budgeting, or how we could control our resources. And when it comes to strategies, we will be talking about different strategies that we can use to process in order to make sure that the resource gaps are met. Now, moving on, I will just give you the main 5 topics that we will be covering under this lesson. So first, we will be talking about the organizational resources. So what are the organizational resources? When it comes to organizational resources, there are different types of organizational resources. However, there are 4 main resources that we generally consider, which we will talk about. So these 4 are the financial resources, the human resource, the tangible or the physical resource, as well as the intangible resource. So thereafter, in the section of allocating resource effectively and efficiently, what we would do is we will talk how all these mentioned resources can be allocated properly and efficiently, so that whatever that we require by a company can be achieved properly. Thereafter, moving forward, we will talk about controlling resources effectively and efficiently, where the main section that we will be talking about will be budgeting, where different types of budget will be talked, and the budgeting process will be talked about. And we will be talking about how the budgets will be used in order to control the resources properly. So, and thereafter, we will be talking about strategic planning. So when it comes to strategic planning, so what we will be doing is we will be talking about the characteristics of strategic planning and the users and the importance of proper strategic planning, and what are the advantages, disadvantages of having a proper strategic planning process. Now, lastly, we will be talking about identification and development of strategies for resource gap. So under this section, what we would do is we will be trying to understand or find out the resource gap that the company has. And so we will be covering the resource gap analysis and its process, and also an example will be used. So one of the things that we would do is we will be talking, doing a small application here where an example will be used to conduct a process gap analysis with how the resources can be controlled to achieve the company objective. So this would be mostly kind of like a practical demonstration where all of you will be able to kind of try and apply what you have learned so far when it comes to resources, instead of just learning about it. And lastly, a resource audit will be conducted. So moving on, now we are going to start talking about the main sections of this module. So initially, what we are going to talk about is organizational resources. So what is a resource? Resource can be defined as a person, an asset, even a material which can be used in order to accomplish a set goal. So it can be illustrated further, let's say, as a stock, a supply of money, a material, even stuff, and any kind of asset. So which can be used by a person or an organization in order to carry on their functions effectively and also efficiently. So in economics, what we generally say is we call it as a resource endowment of factors, or like the factors of production. That is the word that we generally use it. That is considered as commodities or services to be used in order to produce any type of good or service. So resources are generally defined as a service or kind of like any other asset used to produce goods and services that meet the human need or the organizational needs. So this is called as factors of production. So moving on, when we talk about the organizational resources, one of the main things that we will be talking about is the different types of resources. So even though there are many resources that will be used in a company, they can be categorized based on how the resource is utilized. So as you can see, there are many resources and they can be looked at from many different perspectives. So some examples, like for understanding, would be people, money, material, technology, equipment, IT, or even knowledge, which is kind of intangible. And accordingly, here we will be talking about a specific four specific categories or groups where the resources can be segregated into. So what the types that we're talking about would be the financial resources. Thereafter, it would be the human resource, then the physical resource, as well as the intangible resource. So moving forward, so as you can see, first, because this is a finance module, we would start off with the financial resources. So the first category that we're going to talk about is financial resources. So basically, what are these? So these include the sources which would the resources that look at the aspect of how a business is financed. So each and every business requires funds for it to continue their operations, or even to buy assets or move forward with the business. So the sources of funds that a company uses will be called the financial resources. So the sources of funds will obviously differ based on the size as well as the need. So a resource from which the enterprise obtain the funds they need to finance their investment, capital, or current activities will be considered as financial resources. So as an example, let's say cash. Cash, money, and its equivalent, it's a financial resource. And we can't talk about bank deposits, where money is placed in a bank, including check accounts and money market accounts. Thereafter, we can talk about holding of stocks, like the publicly traded stocks that can be easily converted into cash. and are considered financial resources of an organization. Also, like holdings of publicly traded bonds. So there are various types of bonds that can be included in the financial resources of an organization. As an example, the UK government securities, or any country's government securities, the mortgage bonds, the foreign bonds, the corporate bonds, they're all types of publicly traded bonds. Now, another type of finance resource, is the foreign currency holdings. So these are currencies which are basically issued in another country. So foreign countries can be held, so foreign currencies actually can be held in a local or in a foreign bank, and the foreign currency can be quickly converted into the local currency. Therefore, they are also considered as part of the financial reserves of an organization. So generally, these have been used when a company has a branch in a different country. And also, many international companies need to hold amounts of foreign currency in order to carry out its operations, like even selling abroad or paying foreign customers. So also things like checks. So checks are instruments that contain an order that directs the bank, and sometimes checks can be used to pay to suppliers. Checks are financial assets. So financial resources are generally assets for an organization used to carry out the business activities, as well as paying salaries or buying supplies. So financial resources would include shareholder funds, which includes equity capital, as well, as I said, the bank and the other loans, and the working capital, which includes stocks or even debtors or cash, and even already invested, the assets that are already invested in a bank or a business, and its creditors as well. So moving forward, so we can talk more about financial resources. There are different sources of finance available when it comes to financial resources. So from traditional funding sources, as I explained to you, such as the banks and equity investors, or government grants or venture capital funds. But we need to understand that all of these funding methods have their own advantages and own disadvantages. So when it comes to an organization or a company, they need to consider the advantage and disadvantage, and then choose a type of resource that is more suitable to the organization. So organizations should go on with the option which can be obtained at the lowest cost. So one of the things that the organization need to focus on would be to say whether this is of lower cost. However, when it comes to companies, it should also consider the duration when the source of finance funds can be obtained, like whether it's short term or whether it's long term. So this also needs to be considered when it's a financial resources, because a lot of decisions have to be made, and the proper resources need to be used accordingly. So organizations should carefully analyze their capital requirement and see the operations, and see how much working capital is needed for the company to move on with the company operations, and also see the long-term requirement that the company needs. Moving on, now one of the next important things for any organization is the human resource. Why is it? Human resource is human. Now we can do any planning, make out any plan, or come up with any type of strategy to an organization. But in order to work on it, you need the involvement of the human resource, which is basically the stakeholders of the company, or mainly the employees. So human resource is all about people, the staff who operate an organization. So HR is considered to be the backbone. The meaning, because it's the most valuable asset that any organization can possess. This is the only resource that has the ability to coordinate and control the other resources to achieve their overall objectives. So you need the HR department to even plan out how to manage all the other resources. So basically, the HR is the backbone of the organization. And yes, obviously, we need the financial resources. However, without the HR, even the decisions regarding the financial aspect will not be able to be done. So a company is more likely to be successful if it manages all its resources well, including its human resource. So now talking about the human resource. Now, human resource, or HR, is basically the division of a business that is charged with the finding, the screening, the recruitment, and training the job applications. So it also administers employee benefit programs. Now, HR plays a key role in the companies, when it comes to companies, to deal with the fast changing business environment and a greater demand. The greater demand for quality employees are needed in this 21st century. So if you just talk about the human resource, the John R. Commons, an American institutional economist, first coined the term human resource in his book, The Distribution of Wealth, which was published in 1893. However, it was not until the 20th century that the HR departments were formally developed and tasked with addressing misunderstandings between employees and the employers. And HR department is an essential component for any organization. Regardless of an organization size, it is tasked with the maximizing employees, sorry, with maximizing employee productivity and protecting the company from any issues that may arise within the workforce. So HR responsibility, if you look at the responsibility, it includes the compensation and benefits, the recruitment, the firing, and to keep up the date with any laws that may affect the company and its employees. So you need to have a successful HR or human resource in order to have a successful company operations. So moving on, now the next resource that we're going to talk about is intangible resources. Now, what are these resources? Intangible resources are basically resources that are not physical in existence. Generally, they are identified as non-monetary assets that cannot be seen or it cannot be touched. That's why you call it intangible resources. Now, these resources are basically created through a time and effort. Like example, like if you take corporate intellectual property, such as the patent, the trademarks, copyright, business methodologies, the goodwill, the brand recognition. There's so many things that we can talk about, which is an intangible resource for an organization. So intangible resources basically can be classified according to the specification of assets as either definite or indefinite. So before that, let me just explain to you more about intangible resources. So, so intangible resources are not physical in nature. So, so goodwill, brand recognition, intellectual property such as patent, trademarks, or even copyrights are all intangible assets. And financial assets, I forgot to tell all these, financial assets such as, let's say, stocks or bond, which derive their value from contractual terms, these are also considered as intangible assets. So as I told you, these intangible assets can be categorized as definite or indefinite. Now let's see what are the definite, indefinite. Okay, we'll start with indefinite. What are the indefinite intangible resource? So a company's brand name is considered as an indefinite intangible asset because it stays with the company for a long time as it continues its operations. And as an example, a definite, and when it comes to definite, if I talk about a definite example, asset which would be have a legal agreement to operate under another company's patent with no plans of extending the agreement will be called as a intangible asset. Now, agreement has a limited life and classifies as a definite asset. So, agreement is generally a definite asset. And while an intangible asset does not have the obvious physical value of a factory or even like an equipment, it can prove valuable for any organization, to be very critical in the long-term success or the failure. Now, if I take an example, let me take a well-known example of the business such as Coca-Cola. Now, if you take Coca-Cola, so if you take Coca-Cola, will Coca-Cola be nearly as successful if it's not under money made through brand recognition? No. Now, Coca-Cola is generally is a brand that is known very well. Now, even if you take McDonald's, if you take Burger King, these companies has a very kind of a recognized brand, and the brand recognition is considered as an intangible asset which helps the organization in success, because of the brand name, these companies can move into any country in the world, and the customers will coming to just test whatever the food of the beverage, or even if it's clothing, such as, let's say, if you take something like Charles and Keith. So when a Charles and Keith store is kind of open in any country, everyone, like, it's the brand name that everyone knows. So people, as a high-end brand, people would just coming to buy the Charles and Keith bags or the shoes. So as you can see, the brand recognition is not physical. But is it physical? It's just a name. It's not a physical asset which cannot be seen or even touched. So, but it does have a meaningful impact on generating sales. As you can see, I explained using all these examples. So, as a company's brand name can be identified as an indefinite asset, because of the lifetime of the brand name exist. Hold on. As a long-term entity continue its operation. If a company enters into a franchise agreement to use the brand name of another company with no plans of extending the agreement, then it is considered to be a definite asset, as the lifetime of the asset is definite. Now, let's move on to the next section, which is physical or the tangible resources. These are the resources that we generally know about the company. So a tangible asset is an asset that has finite monetary value and usually has a physical form, unlike intangible assets. And tangible assets can typically always be transacted for some monetary value through the liquidity of different markets. Different markets will vary. So tangible assets are the opposite of intangible assets, as I told before, and have a theorized value rather than a transactional exchange value. So tangible assets are generally have a real physical form that may depreciate in value over time. That's why we get like the non-current assets. When it comes to non-current asset, what do? We generally write off the asset value over the useful life. So those non-current assets are basically physical form or tangible resources. Now, tangible resources are recorded on the balance sheet usually as a long-term asset. As I mentioned, the non-current assets, which are buildings or even any type of machinery in a company. And also the tangible resources are usually less liquid than these intangible assets that we are talking about, or the resources. So though tangible resources usually have real world value, they are also associated with potentially higher expenses or risks, such as storage, insurance, and obsolescence. So example of a tangible resource would be like a land, a building, or machinery, or inventory. These are things that we always know. Now, when we talk about the operations of any organization, these are the things that we talk about as a physical asset. So a business network and cooperations are highly dependent on its asset or the resource, because the management of assets and asset implications are one key reason why companies maintain a balance sheet. So generally a balance sheet is maintained mainly because of the physical assets. So assets or the resources, physical resources are recorded on the balance sheet and must balance in simple equation: asset minus liabilities equals shareholder equity, which governs the balance sheet. So I know this is all something very basic, but we need to understand how the resources are connected to financial management or financial accounting. So tangible assets are with finite or discrete value, and usually it's of physical form, obviously, and these are items of company which the company uses in its operation. So generally, these physical or tangible resources are the ones that the company will always use in the operations, whatever it is, when it comes to production, or even if it becomes a kind of a service, there will be a lot of tangible resources that are used in order to move on with the operations. So one of the main parts, tangible resources, even though it doesn't look like it has a lot of meaning, tangible assets or physical resources are imperative to an organization. So moving on. Okay, right. So before moving on, let me talk about the organizational resources. So we talked about the 4 types of resources, and And from the explanations, you will understand that all these resources are very important to run a company. Without one, it's a both, all of them are kind of dependent on each other, because without finance, a company cannot run. Without the tangible resources like a land or machinery, a company cannot move on. Sometimes intangible resources such as knowledge or even a brand name, sometimes the organization cannot move on. And mainly the HR resource is one of the imperative resources for an organization to run, whether it's a manufacturing, goods and service manufacturing company, or even a service company. Moving on. So we are moving on to the next topic, which is allocating resources effectively and efficiently. Now we talked about the resources and different types of resources. Now what I'm going to do is we are going to talk how these resources are allocated. Now I said now it's imperative for us to have the proper resources to manage it. Now, what I'm going to explain to you now is how these resources are allocated, because it's very important to allocate the proper resources in a manner where the organization resources are distributed among different units or even departments in a business standpoint, which is correct and appropriate. So this basically relates to how the capital is distributed among the various operations of a company. And generally in economics, what it is identified as how scarce resources or the factors of production are distributed among different production units or producers, and how these scarce resources and services are distributed among the customers. Now, this is the resource allocation. Well, if I simply tell you, it is simply the assignment of available resources in various uses. So this is the process of assigning and managing assets in a manner that supports the organization's strategic planning goals. So resource allocation generally involves balancing competing needs and priorities, and it also determines the best course of action to maximize the use of limited resources and to get the best return on the investment. So an organization has to make decisions in a long as well as in short, in long term as well as short term. So in an organizational context, there are many factors that have to be considered when it comes to decision making or allocating the resources. So in practicing resource allocation, organization must first establish the desired goal, such as, let's say, what do they generally, what is the main desired goal for a company? It would be increasing the revenue or the profit. And it could also be things such as improving the productivity or trying to better brand recognition. And they then must assess what resources that need to be allocated in order to reach that goal, and which resources need to be allocated in short term and which resources need to be allocated in long term. So resource allocation is very comprehensive, and proper resource allocation will ensure that the company is successful or a failure. So now moving on, I said now when you're allocating the resource, that the resource will be allocated when deciding or in decision making. We will allocate whether it is used in the short run or whether it will be used in the long run. Now, first, as you can see here, we are going to talk about the short run in decision making. So, when an organization takes a decision in short run, which is obviously a period which is less than maybe around 1 year, it needs to be it needs to consider two main factors, as you can see. So the two main factors are relevant cost and the opportunity cost. Now, what is a relevant cost? So relevant cost is basically a cost which occurs due to specific managerial decisions. So relevant cost may be important in one situation, but it could be irrelevant in another situation. Like an example, if you take an example, future costs and revenues, that any cost that has been already incurred is not a relevant cost. And cash costs, like the decision could create an outflow of cash in terms of expenditure. Now, just moving on with relevant costs, just let me give you like more explanatory explanatory thing about relevant cost. So if you talk about relevant cost is a managerial accounting term which describes avoidable cost that is incurred only when making specific business decisions. So basically this concept of relevant cost is used to eliminate unnecessary data that could complicate the decision-making process. And as an example, relevant cost is used to determine whether to sell or keep a business. So you need to understand when it comes to keeping a business or selling, the cost that we would consider would be the relevant cost or the cost that would directly impact the decision itself. So the opposite of relevant cost. Now, what is the opposite of relevant cost? The term that is used is called the sunk cost. That is what you call. So now when it comes to sunk cost is the cost which is already incurred regardless of the outcome of the current decision. So generally management uses relevant cost in decision making, such as whether to close a business, as I explained, to close a business unit, or whether to make or buy parts of labor, or whether to accept a customer's last minute or special order. Now I'm talking about relevant cost. Now you will be thinking, what is this relevant cost? I mean, so it could, even though I tell, these are the, that it is used to close a business unit, I think it would be like good if I could explain to you using like an example, which that all of us understand, not from a financial standpoint, but in general terms. So the example that I'm going to take here is a passenger who rushes into a ticket counter to purchase a ticket for a flight that is going to leave in like 25 minutes. Now you just need to kind of think about that situation. So if you look at the situation, now the airline needs to consider the relevant costs related to making the decision about the ticket price. Now, what are the things that they need to consider? So almost all the costs related to adding an extra passenger have already been incurred, correct? Now, including now, when it comes to the plane fuel, like it's kind of a direct cost that is already incurred, airport gate fee, that also has been incurred, and the salary and the benefits for the entire plane crew. Now it is already done. So those are they relevant costs now? No, because now these costs have already been incurred. They are called sunk costs or irrelevant costs. So in this decision, the additional cost that which is the relevant cost would be the labor to load the passenger's luggage and any food that is served mid-flight. So the airline bases the last-minute ticket pricing decision on few small costs. Now can you see the what? Now, from the example, now let's see from this example, what are the sunk costs? So the sunk costs that I spoke about is like the plane fuel cost, like the airport gate fee, the salaries of the entire cabin crew. They're all sunk cost. It is a cost that is sunk already or irrelevant. So the only extra cost that the airline is going to incur would be the labor cost to load the passenger's luggage and the food cost. So those are the relevant costs in this particular decision making. So I hope now you understood this relevant cost. So in short-term decision making, relevant cost is very important. So the example I gave is also like a short-run decision making kind of a situation where the airline needs to consider what they need to do when trying to include the cost for that the person or the passenger who wants to the ticket counter to purchase a ticket last minute. So the next thing that we would consider in short run decision making would be the opportunity cost. Now, opportunity cost is the value of benefit that is sacrificed when one course of action is chosen. Or this is the contribution foregone by selecting the alternative over the next best alternative. So when there are many alternatives, the opportunity cost is the cost of the next best alternative, because it is generally showing us the benefit that we sacrifice by taking one course of action instead of choosing the other. So those are the two things that short-run decision making while resource allocation will be done. Moving on, we are going to talk about long run. Now we spoke about short run, and we will be talking about the long run decision making. Now, when a decision is taken for long run, many factors need to be considered because they affect the overall purpose of the company and why this business was established. So there are many factors, unlike in short-term decision making. So one of the things that need to be focused on is the resources or investment to be made, like the availability of the resource, including the human resource, the financial resource, the physical resource, as well as the intangible resource. And then the organization has to allocate its resources based on stakeholder expectation as a whole. And also the other another factor that we need to consider would be the return on investment or the profitability. So when it comes to the return, we should consider the maximum of investors, or at least the minimum that they would kind of expect. And thereafter, the risk involved need to be considered. Why? The organization has to understand the types of risk which will involve and how far the stakeholders are willing to invest in a high risk investment, because the shareholders are the ones who are foregoing their kind of the profit or their dividend and kind of saying okay to the high risk investment. And also moving on, hold on. Sorry. So the other factor that will be focused on would be the strategic capability. Now, strategic capability is just knowing like the capability of an organization is very important, because before allocating organizational resource, because resources should be allocated on alternative where the firm can use its threshold resources or the core competencies in order to make sure that they will have their competitive edge over the other players of the industry. So whatever resources that are allocated, first the company needs to understand what is our competitive edge and which areas could we focus on when allocating our resources. And then the last one that we will be talking about would be the industry or the product life cycle. So if the organization is going to allocate its resources in making products that are in the maturity or decline stages in the market, the resource allocation will not give a good return over a long period of time. So it is always better to kind of invest in the services or even the solution that is at the introductory or the growth stage, because hence the organization is able to kind of capitalize on the industry conveniently in matured market. So now next, we need to talk about controlling resources effectively and efficiently. So for that, we actually have to talk about budgeting. And budgeting is a vast area which cannot be, done very quickly. And because we are almost done with today's session, I will not be starting on budgeting. And so before that, what I thought is I would just do a quick recap on what we spoke about today. Now, starting about strategic management, strategic financial management, I kind of explained to you what strategic financial management is. And thereafter, I explained about the module content and what we will be studying under this module. So there are 6 main sections that we will be studying, as I told you, which includes the organizational resources, introduction to financial management, then the business processes, the activity-based costing, identification of resource, as well as the communication. So thereafter, I just kind of explained the lesson specification where we talked about how it's important to effectively allocate resources and controlling the resources properly, and how this lesson will ensure that a good knowledge on resource gaps will be given to all who study, and how the control will be done, and strategies that will be identified based on the resource gap. So this specific lesson specification kind of divided into 5 main topics. The first topic was organizational resources, then allocating resources effectively and efficiently, then controlling resources, strategic planning and identification, and developing strategies for resource gaps. So when it comes to these, I just explained to you the organizational resources and the allocating of resource effectively and efficiently. And I told you controlling resources section has budgeting, which is a vast area. And obviously I cannot be covering it within a short period that is remaining. So we talked about the organizational resources, and then said that there are 4 types of organizational resources. The classification was such that we said it is final that you have 4 types, which is the financial resource. So I talked about the financial resource and how it will help an organization to finance, and how important it is like to check whether it is a long-term financing resource or mid-term financing resource, or even whether it is a short-term financing resource. Thereafter, I also talked about human resources and explained how the human resource is like the backbone of the organization, because whatever that we decide or whatever we decide on allocating needs to be conducted using the human resource. So without the human resource, and a company cannot process or cannot operate properly. So So human resource is one of the most important resources for a company or an organization. And also, I spoke about the intangible resources and explained to you what intangible resources are. Like, I gave an example of like copyright, trademarks, and goodwill. And we talked about how the brand recognition is very important. I used this example of how Coca-Cola, even McDonald's, and when it comes to brands such as Charles and Keith can just use their brand recognition in order just to enter any country, and like so that the customers would just come in and then buy their products. So I explained how this intangible resource of brand recognition is very important to certain companies which has a very strong brand recognition. So I also talked how this could be a definite intangible resource as well as an indefinite intangible resource. And thereafter, I spoke about physical or tangible resources. So that is basically the resources that we generally see. So I explained to you that these physical resources are the one which depreciate over time, and they're the ones that are generally included in the balance sheet. So example, the non-current assets or the land or the machinery that are generally included as assets and then depreciated over their time is generally the tangible resources. And generally in the balance sheet, it is considered as long-term assets, and it could even be short-term assets such as stocks. So those are tangible things, or even cash, which is tangible as well. However, cash is generally a financial resource as well. So through tangible resources, the real world value is increased, and potentially high expenses or risks such as storage, insurance, and obsolescence are associated when it comes to tangible resources, because we need to maintain those tangible resources, unlike the intangible resource. So I gave you example, land, building, machinery, inventory as such. And moving on, I talked about allocating resources effectively and efficiently. And in there, we talked about resource allocation, how the factors of production are allocated among short-term as well as long-term when it comes to decision making. And for that, we spoke about short-run decision making of resource allocation, where I spoke about the main factors, which is relevant cost. I gave you an example of the sunk cost and the relevant cost. Thereafter, I explained how the opportunity cost works. Also, at last, I explained about long-run decision making, where we talked about few factors such as resource or investment to be made, the return on investment or profitability, the risk involved, and also like the strategic capability as well as the industry product life cycle. So with that, we've completed the recap of today's lesson, and I'm hoping to continue with the budgeting and the remaining section in the next lesson. And I hope that all of you kind of understood what I explained. And if there's anything, you could always kind of email and ask about it. And I have a nice day. Thank you.